You're watching MP Live. Well, the new Premier of Ontario is Doug Ford, here with their perspective on the winner, the campaign and the road ahead, from the National Post columnist Andrew Coyne, Chris Sully, Christy Blatchford, and from Toronto's Toronto Sun, I should say, the editor-in-chief Adrian Batra. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Initial reactions. Doug Ford is the Premier of Ontario. Andrew Coyne.
That's mine too.
It's going to be an interesting 4 years. He has a talent for mayhem, and I'm sure it's not going to diminish. And the other flip side, of course, is
My first reaction, my natural reaction, is laughter. And the next one is anticipation. I agree. I think it's going to be a wonderful time to be a journalist.
Adrian, who did you vote for and why?
No, I think everybody knows exactly who I voted for. People wanted change, and they got change, and in a big, big way. The province of Ontario was painted blue last night in a tidal wave. And I think Doug Ford is going to surprise a lot of people with how he governs, the people whom he surrounds himself by, and it's a good day for the people of Ontario.
Chris, is it a good day for the people of Ontario?
I just don't know. I mean, I think this government could look like a whole lot of different things. And as Adrian says, if he could surround himself with his moderate MPs and really foreground them and take advice from people, or he could be
Doug Ford.
the sort of the belligerent Doug Ford. But there's at least two different Doug Fords. So I wouldn't predict what this is going to look like. I think it could look like a whole lot of different things.
Let's take a look at some of those maps from Ontario. I think you all have those maps and you know what they look like. Let's go back to 2014, what that looked like in Ontario, which was, of course, painted all red. 2018 brings a very different picture. What were some of the, I guess, key areas where the PCs won, where they dominated, and where they lost?
Well, I mean, the PCs did well across the province. I mean, the key was that they needed to keep the NDP from breaking through in areas like Scarborough and Etobicoke and some of these ridings like Sarnia and Peterborough, where the NDP really had to break through if they had any hope of pulling this off. And they didn't pull it off. The PCs pulled it off quite handily in those ridings. So it just didn't work out the way it needed to.
And even in Brampton, of course, they were targeting a lot of seats in Brampton. And we know Guruthan Singh, of course, who's Jagmeet Singh's brother. He won handily there. But even if you look at Scarborough they anticipated it to be totally orange. But where Doug Ford won in those specific ridings, that is where he did well in the 2014 mayoralty race. So that sort of, quote, Ford factor did matter for those ridings.
where these elections, federal and provincially, decided is in the suburbs and exurbs. Conservatives usually do well rurally, usually do very poorly in the inner cities, but it's when they're doing well, they're winning those suburbs, the 905 belt, as we say, and they certainly cleaned up en masse in this election. What was interesting was in the inner cities, in the central cities, the Liberals were replaced by the NDP en masse, except for a couple of enclaves in Ottawa and Toronto. But
Hugely in Toronto.
Yeah,
I mean,
not even
Toronto,
close.
just an absolute.
I live in St.
landslide.
Paul's, and there were three strong candidates, and I thought they would be a Liberal or a Tory, as traditionally it has been. And it must be the first time St. Paul's has had a new Democrat. Surely to God.
What a legacy to be the person who lost St. Paul's for the Liberals.
Yeah, you sort of look at that one, and when an Ottawa Vanier is like the strong Liberal strongholds, but not this time. Not for St. Paul's.
Did Doug Ford win this for the PCs, or did he almost lose it for them? Because there's been talk that it wasn't for him. It was for the party, for their collective idea.
they came into this election 15 to 20 points ahead for months, so he didn't manage to lose it. But I don't think it was really a pro-Ford vote. I'm sure some voted for that, but it was mostly people wanted to get rid of the Liberals, or a certain section of the population wanted to get rid of the Liberals. And then, of course, what also could aid in the Liberal support was a certain section of the population then was very alarmed at the prospect of Ford getting in and switched from the Liberals to the NDP because they looked like the party that could best stop him. I actually think if it had been Christine Elliott as leader, they would have won even bigger than they did.
Well, look, I think let's be a little charitable to Doug Ford for a moment. He came into a party that went through this drama with Patrick Brown. He was a leader in very short order. He had a big mess on his hands. He had all these issues with candidates and different ridings. And the PCs have basically been in the lead for, let's say, 3 years in the polls, for example. So yeah, he didn't lose it for them. This is a party that's been out in the wilderness for 15 years. You can imagine the pressure that was on Ford, because he was very well aware members of his party didn't want him. So a lot of people in the public didn't want him. and he confounded them yet again, and with a very successful night. So a lot of credit is where it's due to him.
Okay, let me ask you. So there are plenty of pundits that said, basically this was an election whereby you couldn't choose a clear winner just because there weren't great candidates. And of the three, there weren't any great candidates. So was this the best person for the job ultimately?
No, not in my view. I think the best person for the job is Kathleen Wynne. I mean, if you were coming from another planet, and you were looking at the three candidates, and you judged them only by who the leaders were and how well spoken they were and how substantial they seemed, I think she would have been the clear winner because she's intelligent, she can think on her feet. Guess what? She speaks in sentences, not, kind of moronic clauses. So I liked her for that reason, and I think, if voters were only voting on the quality of the candidate, the leadership candidate, they would have picked her. But obviously, 15 years of Liberal government, a lot of voter fatigue, a lot of scandals, people were enraged by much of what they saw, and a lot of that was sort of captured, I think, in the Hydro One thing, where the board itself of Hydro One had voted themselves a rich raise just in the middle of the election campaign. I mean, come on!
Chris, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I think, is Doug Ford the best person for the job? No, but on the other hand, the Tories have a pretty solid team, and it looked to me, if you looked at the polls, that the brand really is still quite strong. You look at the polls; it's people trust the party the most on the economy, on fighting, cutting the deficit, cutting debt. I mean, it's ironic because the platform doesn't promise any of that. Like, the platform is a big spending platform with no specifics as to where all these savings are going to come from. But I think that enough people still saw the party, however they factored in Doug Ford to that decision, they saw the party as the only real natural option, given that they wanted to get rid of the Liberals.
It was slightly less big spending, so far as anyone can make out, than the other two parties. So not particularly conservative, but maybe just conservative enough. I think the problem for the NDP was, there was this large block of voters, not by any means the whole province. Of course, the Tories got 40% of the vote, not 100%. But there was this large block of voters that wanted to get rid of the Liberals. Did they want to go with a party that was going to do everything the Liberals did and more? Or did they want a party of the Conservatives that would do everything the Liberals did and slightly less? That's what
I mean, I was
ultimately
With a slate of pretty radical candidates.
I always wonder if NDP had run one of their centrist platforms that they had the last two times, if that might have been better for them.
The NDP?
They were determined not to be outflanked by Wynne, but it turned out Wynne wasn't the problem.
But Wynne went so left, right? I mean, there was no space and no daylight left between the NDP and the Liberal
no,
at this
that's what
point.
I mean.
So where is she left to go? I mean,
Some key moments in 5 or 10 seconds, some key moments from the campaign.
Certainly the most striking one for me was when Wynne conceded the election with 5 days to go.
Yes.
It wasn't any great surprise to anybody. You could sort of see the thinking behind it, that if people were worried that by voting Liberal they'd actually elect a Liberal government, she could set those voters' minds at rest, but certainly nothing I've ever seen in a previous election.
Christy.
I thought it was interesting, the theft of the 407 customer data and the questions that followed and still remain about the legitimacy of many of the, I think as many as a dozen of the Tory nomination races. I think these are big problems. I'll leave it at that.
Key moments?
well, I wish I would have gone first. But so I agree with Andrew. It's extraordinary for someone to write their own political obituary before the votes are even cast. So Premier Wynne resigning and just saying, I can't do this anymore. I know I'm not going to win. What a moment. I mean, I can't remember a time when something like that has
Anyone
ever
ever has
happened.
done
The 407 stuff was certainly significant and remains a problem, you're right, and they have a big challenge on their hands. I think when Bernarda Ford came out and said that the family is not providing for her, and all of the stuff that's being thrown at Doug, it didn't seem to matter. Change was coming.
Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I have to go with Wynne again. I mean, she comes in promising to be a different kind of politician. I mean, that's basically what allowed her to get a majority in 2014, was the idea that she was turning the page from Dalton McGuinty, and she goes out with having brought in a Doug Ford majority. and having torpedoed the NDP, having sabotaged the NDP's chances, which leaves so many Ontarians having to look at her and say, like, what?
Sorry, not
What-
sorry.
What was that?